women are not as obsessed with control and power and domination as men are.
Women generally don't commit crimes this heinous. You know, this is usually the domain of men.
That's unfortunate. Oh, yeah, equal opportunity, definitely.
He said, "Mom, I don't want to die. Please, I don't want to die."
That's okay.
Boom.
Throughout the night, you could hear him calling out in his room. He was yelling out, "I love you," and "I'm sorry."
Will you kill again?
If the opportunity arises, I hope so.
When women kill, it's shocking because as a society, we are all socialized to expect certain stereotypic behaviors in women. They're congenial, they play nicely, they know how to be cooperative, and they certainly aren't violent.
People are used to thinking of men as the part of the species that's aggressive and kills people or does something violent. When people think of women who've killed someone, it's alarming to them. It sort of violates the norm of sugar and spice and all things nice. That's what girls are made of, right? We would prefer to believe that women are not violent. But it's not true. From a scientific perspective, most studies on psychopathy have been conducted in male prisoners. So the data are skewed. Right now, we tend to think of women being a small percentage of psychopathic killers. But I do think there's a greater number than we imagine. I think that as a group, female psychopaths, they're both overlooked and they're underestimated.
Over the years, popular culture has assigned labels to particularly heinous crimes that have been committed by females that have been thought to be psychopaths. We're going to examine some of the unique characteristics of female psychopathy and explore the horrific crimes that they've committed.
So normally if you use the term vigilante, people will think of a man, maybe even a cowboy film from the West. People will generally think of it as a man who's a vigilante trying to seek justice, Zorro. They don't think right away a woman. And that's why the female psychopath who is a vigilante flies under our radar.
Vigilante is both judge and jury, and they decide who lives and who dies. And while we see male psychopaths that have that vigilante justice streak in their crimes, we do see that more often with female psychopathic offenders. One of the more notorious or well-known vigilante psychopaths is Aileen Wuornos.
By her own admission, Wuornos was a hitchhiking highway who killed 7 motorists in 1 year.
I still say to myself, I still say that it was a self-defense.
It's shocking because women who use extreme violence are rare. And so, as human beings, we are always attracted to or respond to things which are rarer. We idealize womanhood in very stereotypical and unrealistic ways, which then leads to the flip, where we then sensationalize their violence. So men's violence is normalized, and women's violence is sensationalized.
When Wuornos is initially caught, she claims that she killed these men because she was sexually assaulted by them, she was physically beaten by them. But the evidence just doesn't support that. What we know is some of the victims were actually shot in the back. To make matters worse, Wuornos stole their cars, she stole their wallets, and robbery was a secondary gain.
Aileen is a woman who has an upbringing that is not trauma-free. She has a history of abuse and decides that it would be fine to rid the world of men who then solicit sex workers. So she's able to seduce men with the promise of having sex with them and then killing them. It's her way of cleaning up the world. From a psychoanalytic perspective, we might say she's paying the world back for whatever abuse she suffered. There's also a sense of gratification. They're fulfilling a fantasy of something that they want. We see similar justification in another female psychopath, Angela Simpson.
Wow, I killed Terry.
Tell me how and why.
I killed Terry
by deceptively luring him to apartment 201, sitting him down, and beating him with various objects until he was unconscious, and then I slit his throat. I told him upstairs, when I do give you some I do, because that's what he kept asking me to do. Would you please? Oh, yeah.
Is that what he thought he was going to get?
Exactly. That's why I deceptively lured him up there.
The use of sex or promises of sexual favors and sexual interactions or flirting is a strategy that female offenders do use more so than male psychopathic offenders. In the case of both Warnos and Simpson, we see that they were able to use this tool of promises of sex and sexual favors to lure their victims in. Ultimately, in the process, these women found a way to access them when their guards were down, and they were in essentially their most vulnerable state.
Why?
Why? Because Terry told me that he was an informant. He said that he met with the DA periodically, still, regarding cases that are, I don't know, 10 to 16 years old, crazy. Proceeded to beat him to death.
With the tire iron?
Tire iron, a stick, a hammer. Yes, I did have my hammer.
There's no evidence that the victim was ever an informant. Simpson's outlook is that she is superior to most people in that she gets to decide who's a snitch. She gets to decide if they live or die.
Simpson is describing her act of killing men. It's so matter-of-fact while she's eating, just mentioning that she has stabbed, tortured him, as if it's the same thing as asking for potato chips or a Diet Coke. There's nothing shocking about it. And this is one of the traits that we do talk about in psychopathy, that people have low empathy and that they seem callous and indifferent to other human life. And this is a feature that we don't automatically associate with women.
I was very high just on the act alone, dude.
Men are usually thought of as being stronger, bigger, and more dominating of women. And in this situation, she's flipped the power dynamic. It's the male who is helpless and who is bound, and she is fully in control of everything that will happen to him, including his death.
We've all heard the phrase that hell hath no fury like a woman that's scorned. Generally, female psychopaths tend to be less physically violent and more interpersonally aggressive and manipulative than male psychopaths. However, when women psychopaths are betrayed or rejected, sometimes they do become violent, as we'll see in the case with Jodi Arias.
I have to ask you this. Did you kill Travis Alexander?
Absolutely not. No, I had no part in it.
But a police report shows forensic evidence tying Arias to the murder. Alexander was stabbed 27 times, shot once, and his throat was cut open.
Jodi Arias, upon hearing that her ex-boyfriend was going to be going away with another woman, became triggered because it was the ultimate rejection for her. Basically, it said, he's moved on, and now she no longer has control over him.
While rejection is difficult for people to accept, the majority of us are able to process it, move on from it. But in the case of a female psychopath who is violent, their ability to handle rejection and their ability to regulate their emotions of anger and loss and grief really are significantly lacking.
Was he alive when he was stabbed in the heart?
Yes.
Was he alive, in your opinion, when his throat was slit?
Yes.
Normally, when we hear that term about scorn, we always think of a romantic relationship where people have been attached and then the relationship's fallen apart. But it can be more broad than that. A person doesn't have to be in a romantic relationship to feel vengeance is necessary, needed. And a nice example of that is actually in the Psychopath case.
Is he dead?
Should he be?
Yes.
If he was dead, why would he be dead? From what?
Killing him. I was getting dressed. He said, you can't go like that because it looks like you're ghetto in this. Made me mad.
And then what happened?
Went and shot him. He said,
Oh, I don't want to die. Please, I don't want to die.
I said, that's okay. Boom.
Sidibaka is in her early 60s, and she's had a history of a stroke. She's living with her daughter and her son-in-law. And when he speaks in a disparaging way about an outfit that she's wearing, her clothing, and she interprets it as a put down of who she is as a person. It's sort of an insult that cuts right to the core, that is disrespectful. We might say in psychiatry that this is a narcissistic injury. And with a psychopath, that's particularly dangerous.
How many rounds do you remember firing?
15.
Did he say anything to you?
Grandma, I love you.
After you shot him, then what did you do?
Went to Denny's.
The complete lack of remorse that she's showing is somewhat stunning, particularly given her age as a female. When you look at Cynthia Sidibaka, you think of somebody's grandmother. You think of a kind, gentle person who wants to nurture her family, who has a softness about her, and there's nothing soft or gentle about Cynthia Sidibaka. She is a female psychopathic offender who just killed her son-in-law.
You did, isn't it?
Yeah, you did.
Good. I shot him. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, thank you. Thank you to take me whenever. Oh, God. Oh, God.
In our culture and society, oftentimes elderly women are invisible. They're not seen as authority figures. They're also not seen as sexual creatures or as attractive individuals any longer. Female psychopathic offenders oftentimes are aware about how society perceives them, as well as the stereotypical expectations of how a female will behave. And that isn't any more true than Dorothea Puente.
Police have finally caught up with Dorothea Puente. She is the woman who is suspected of killing 7 people and burying them in the yard of her boarding house in Sacramento for their Social Security checks.
I have not killed anyone. I told you that. I have not killed anyone. The checks I cashed, yes.
Puente flew under the radar and wasn't detected for quite some time because, first of all, she disguised herself. Puente was only in her 50s, but she let herself look different and older than she really was. And she was also somebody who ran this boarding home. People looked at her as a caregiver. So nobody was suspecting what she was doing, that she was in fact a serial killer. Another individual who used her identity and her occupation as a caregiver to avoid detection was Elizabeth Wetlofter.
I knew the difference between right and wrong, but I thought this was something that God or whoever wanted me to do. They could be a bit of a handful. He would grab the nurses, grab anesthetics, but he did touch me inappropriately once.
Run me through.
About 9:30, I gave him a dose of 50 milligrams of insulin. Non-diabetic. So throughout the night, he was yelling that I love you and I'm sorry. And then at 3:30, the doctor came in and said that his cause of death was from an embolism due to his closed hip. And afterwards, I did feel a release, like a release of pressure.
We go to the hospital, we think the people who are there, or to a nursing home, they're there to help us. They don't abuse people, they certainly don't kill them. And then her type of psychopathy is centered around this notion. We can think of the angel of mercy type of serial killer. What she'll say to other people is, they shouldn't live that long, or I'm helping them along. Although when we look at her statements more closely, we end up finding that there's more than meets the eye.
What's different about the way female psychopaths engage in violent behavior versus male psychopaths is that when they are violent, sometimes it's a little more discreet, whereas we might expect a male to stab someone or shoot someone. In this case, it's much more subtle, and it also makes it more difficult to detect.
So in the case of Ms. Wetlaufer, she is in a system that also facilitates her access to people and her access to drugs. And we do know that women who kill may be more likely to use poisons or medications. For many female psychopaths who kill, they'll choose a poison or choose something that's not violent. And so for a psychopath who's working in a healthcare system, it fits in a very hand-in-glove sort of way that there are drugs available that are normal, but in certain doses are lethal. So they're not obvious poisons. They have access to them. They can administer them to people. And it makes the deaths usually go unnoticed. They're attributed to either death of natural causes or something else. And this does fit with what we know, at least in part, about female psychopaths. If they choose to kill, it tends to be a less violent method.
She just got harder and harder to look after, and one night when I had to look after her, I started getting the feeling of that surge again. So, yeah, I overdosed her.
When you work in a nursing facility, you're expecting patients to have some behavioral and/or emotional difficulty. She's accepted a role as a nurse, as a caregiver to people who need help, and she's ultimately using that to kill people. She's a great example of a female psychopath. She's using her knowledge and her role as a caregiver to kill someone in a way that's very discreet and could have flown under the radar for who knows how many more victims had she not come forward.
I decided I didn't want to nurse anymore. I didn't want to hurt anybody anymore.
While Wetlaufer was the caregiver to all of her victims, it's important to note that she didn't kill them on day one. She facilitated a relationship with them, she bonded with them, and ultimately poisoned them.
Another distinction between male and female psychopaths is their motive. Male psychopaths may have a motive such as sexual gratification or pleasure, for example, like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy. But female psychopaths tend to have a motive toward greed and financial security and stability. The label Black Widow has been assigned to females who kill significant others or spouses to gain some sort of financial means or security. And a great example of that is Jill Coit.
This Southern belle, once a former model and beauty queen, has been married 10 times, and no less than 2 of her husbands have died in mysterious circumstances.
There was always a different person, a different man.
Her youngest son, William, doesn't remember much about his father, Clark. He was just 3 years old in 1972 when his dad was found murdered. Jill Coit was the cops' #1 suspect.
I have never murdered anyone, and I definitely did not murder Mr. Coit.
To this day, the case remains unsolved. Jill received almost $200,000 in stocks and bonds from her husband's estate.
Jill Coit is an individual who married multiple times, She married men and lured them out of money, out of their life savings, out of their homes. She got them to take care of her children while she moved on to her next victim. She made up fantastic stories to gain their sympathy.
I don't smoke or drink. I guess my greatest sin is that I get married.
Ultimately, Jill Coit ends up marrying a gentleman named Jerry Boggs. When Jerry figured out that Jill was a liar, his mission was to make sure that everybody knew that Jill Coit was a fraud. Ultimately, he sued her for fraud. 6 days before that trial was set to begin, Jill convinced her new boyfriend to dress in a disguise, women's clothing, a wig, and to enter the home and shoot and kill Jerry Boggs.
So we know that male psychopaths tend to target random victims, people they don't necessarily know. But in contrast, female psychopaths tend to target individuals they know. They develop close relationships sometimes with the very people that they're going to take advantage of. And some female psychopaths will use behavior like flirtation and sex in order to manipulate and entrap their victims. And a great example of that is Dalia DiPolito.
Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house, and there were shots fired. Is your husband Michael? Okay, I'm sorry to tell you, man, he's been killed. Sure you want to kill this dude?
I'm a lot tougher than what I love.
How long have you guys been married?
Not even a year.
It's tragic. Is there anybody you could think of that would want to do this to him?
My husband's on probation for stock fraud.
Stock fraud? Was he spending time in prison?
It was for taking money. So it was a lot of money. It was $100,000 that he had to pay back. People weren't happy that he was getting on probation.
What's interesting about DiPolito's case is that she actually was working as an escort when she met her husband, and it's a transactional relationship that's mutually agreed upon.
DiPolito worked in commercial sex, which means she's repeatedly been, in some ways, dehumanized, probably exposed to violence, and probably does not think highly of men, nor see them as anything else but objects that purchase her and ill-treat her. Dalia DiPolito learned about her husband's property and life insurance before she married him. And so this is sort of a long-term plan where she seduces him, she marries him, and then she puts a hit on him to inherit property and life insurance. So it wasn't impulsive. She planned it coldly.
That's how I'm gonna do it. The robbery went bad. Now, once that's done, you know, I'll wait a few days. I'm not gonna call you right away because the police gonna be all over this. Understand?
I'm a lot tougher than what I look. I know you're like, oh, what a cute little girl, whatever. You know, but I'm not.
When DiPolito tells the undercover officer, who she thinks is a hitman, that she's tougher than she looks and she knows that he sees her as a cute little girl, what she's actually giving us is a little bit of insight and awareness into what she knows about how to manipulate others. While DiPolito believes she's going to walk out of this as a single rich lady, she's about to find out that her reality is absolutely not coming true.
Come here, please. Come here. Mike, come here.
Can't
Why not? I didn't do anything.
I heard you.
Mike, come here, please.
So despite being obviously caught, you don't see the remorse that you would expect to see. She's actually trying to regain control of the situation and manipulate her husband again. And she's almost playing the victim.
Oftentimes, society doesn't find it hard to see women as fragile and frail, the damsel in distress, that victim that needs rescuing. But when you have a female psychopath who knows that about society and uses that to their advantage, what you might actually have is not a damsel in distress, but a stone-cold killer, like the case of Pamela Smart.
We had sex.
By that you mean intercourse?
Yeah, we made love.
In court today, Smart admitted to having a steamy affair with a teenage student, but eventually tried to break it off. The defendant says the student, William Flynn, was so distraught at the prospect of not seeing her that he threatened to kill himself, but ended up killing her husband.
Do you want this jury to understand that Bill Flynn decided to kill your husband because you broke up with him?
I don't know why Bill Flynn killed Greg. I can just come in here and give my testimony.
So even as you sit here today, you still have no idea why he may have done this. Is that it?
I didn't say I had no idea, but I don't know specifically.
Well, I'm asking you, what do you think? Why do you think he did this?
Probably because he thought we could be together.
There are several characteristics of psychopathy that we can see in this scenario with Pamela Smart. First of all, she is failing to accept any responsibility for this. Second of all, there is no remorse. There's no indication that she feels bad that her husband was killed in the first place. It's rather cold and callous in the way she talks about it. There is no emotion behind it. It's really, if anything, she feels indignant and seemingly upset with the student for sending her to prison.
The damsel in distress ruse that female psychopaths can use can be very effective. An example in the case of Jennifer Pan, who used the ruse quite effectively initially, but it didn't work in the end.
Help me, please. I need help. I don't know my parents are. Some people broke into our house.
Okay, you heard gunshots?
They had guns, and they were holding me at gunpoint.
Please?
Dad?
I, upstairs in my room, called it a night with the TV on. I believe that was around 9:30 or so. Suddenly, I could hear the voices. And a guy was there, and he came at me and had string in his hands and tied my arms back and said, I have a gun behind your back. Do what I say. If you do what I say, then no one will get hurt. Where is the money? Show me where your money is. And then I heard 2 pops. My mom screamed. I yelled out for her. And at that point, I had my phone on me, behind me, that I had hidden there that they didn't know about. I whipped up the phone and I called 911. But I still hadn't heard anything from my mom, and all I could hear was my dad running on the street, moaning and making sounds.
She keeps holding her hand over her heart. She speaks in a soft voice, is trying to cry at times. She looks vulnerable. We do have that instinct as humans to try and help another human in distress. And so it's effective as a ruse because it lets the psychopath go undetected if we think we're helping the victim and we don't realize we're actually helping the murderer. But it doesn't take long for the detectives to figure out that something doesn't quite add up.
Stand up and turn around. Put this in the side that you believe it was in. Put your hands behind your back, exactly how you remember they were.
They tied my upper arm around the banister, but my hands were bound together.
So now how can you get to the phone, and how do you make the phone call?
You made me, now I feel like I've said something wrong.
We find out that for the last 4 or 5 years, she has been leading a double life, one which she has constructed intricately Her parents believe that she's going to pharmacy school, she's gaining a degree, that things are going beautifully. And then in the real life, she's really not doing anything. And we discover that her parents strongly disapproved of her boyfriend, who has a criminal record and is a drug dealer.
You admittedly lied. You've lied to your parents about going to school. Who's to say this whole thing isn't a lie? Because if you are lying, it's the most cold-blooded thing that I've ever faced in my life.
I think the parents were probably going to cut her off and not give her any money. And then we see the reactive rage to that. So an additional element of psychopathy is the parasitic lifestyle, we call it, meaning that they will live off of other people. And in Pan's case, she wants her parents' money. She's been enjoying living off their money. She has been a parasite. She's lying to them to get all the benefits of living with them, as long as she can get everything else that she wants.
Pan says he saw his daughter Jennifer untied, whispering back and forth with one of the intruders, and he described that conversation as soft and friendly. He says he could hear his wife begging for their daughter's safety. "Don't hurt her," she cried. And then the trigger was pulled.
She worked with her boyfriend to set up a murder, and he had hired men to come into the house and kill her parents. She could no longer keep up the lies, so that her entire world was going to collapse.
To want to hear your parents get killed, or to see it, rather than asking someone to come in and kill her parents while she's away, it means she's much more callous and cold-hearted. We say that of lacking empathy in psychopathy.
When we think about parent and child relationships, in the case of Jennifer Pan, parents don't think that their children would ever harm them. As they get older, they put trust in their children to take care of them, to care for them, and to remain watchful. We also think of parent-child relationships in the reverse, that parents are charged with keeping their children safe, except in the cases of female psychopathic killers, what we think of in popular culture as mommy dearest. And that couldn't be more obvious than in the case of Susan Smith.
I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home.
In 1994, Susan Smith got on national television and pleaded with the person who supposedly had carjacked her with her 2 young children sleeping in the back. But what we now know, tragically, is that while she was on national television pleading for the return of her children, Susan Smith the whole time knew that her children were dead at the bottom of a lake.
She wanted to be in a new romantic relationship, and the man she was interested in was not interested in dating a woman with young children. Susan Smith strapped her children into their car seats and let the car essentially roll into a body of water where they slowly drowned.
For a woman to turn around and kill her kids is not right. There's no way to explain it. You can't even understand it.
It's shocking because, in fact, women who use extreme violence are quite rare. We are primed as a culture to be more in shock when women are violent, where we normalize men's violence. If someone has psychopathic traits and they become a mother, it might change things for a little while. And the part that's narcissistic, she might be excited at the idea of creation or birth. But once the reality comes in, the deep personal sacrifices, the loss of time, where you put your money, the perhaps absence of attention from potential partners, it immediately and quickly becomes less exciting.
To be a successful, effective parent, your children's needs oftentimes come before your own. And in the case of Elaine Campione, that was something that smacked her in the face when she and her husband separated, and he filed for full custody of both of their daughters.
You know, everything, God, I hate you. I truly, truly hate you.
So what happened last night?
Sophia was having a bath. It's like the usual routine that we always take.
So what happens when she's finished her bath?
She gets out of the tub and I dried her off. She was really, really tired.
Mm-hmm.
So I just got her in her pajamas and put her into bed.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went up to the living room, was cleaning up everything. I had took a bunch of pills.
Elaine Campione's sense of self-worth, her identity, and her entire sense of self was based on the idea that she was this perfect mother. She was doting over the children. She was a loving mother. And ultimately, her ex-husband's decision to leave the family was not just a rejection of her, but it was him rejecting her daughters. This is Campione's narrative. So her ex-husband now files for full custody in court. So in her mind, Elaine Campione only has one choice.
I was getting really retired. I curled up with Sophia. She was cold.
Mm-hmm.
Usually they turn and cuddle in with me. They weren't cuddling in with me.
Mm-hmm.
And Sophia had weird colored lips.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at Serena, and she was looking weird too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I thought there was something wrong.
What she's essentially describing are the postmortem effects of her having drowned them to death. And after Elaine Campione drowns each of her daughters and then dresses them up in cute little princess dresses, curls their hair, and puts them to bed, dead. And while it may seem like Elaine Campione is having a psychotic episode and she's out of touch with reality, what we know from the rest of the case file is this was just another example of Campione's attempts to manipulate investigators.
At any point, did you push her under the water?
No. These are my babies. I've been trying to teach them not to be scared of the water.
Did you kill both of them?
I cannot speak without an attorney present.
So her performance appears theatrical. It appears as if she's saying what she thinks will help her manipulate the situation. She's acting the way she thinks might be helpful for her, pretending as if she has no idea what's going on. She actually very clearly does just a few minutes later whenever she asks for a lawyer.
Hey, Serena, who loves ya?
Mommy.
Who loves you the most? That much? Oh, I think I love you more than that.
She created this video of her girls just before she murdered them. She's presenting herself as this very loving mother. It's almost like she wanted to create this to further hurt her ex-husband, to show him, look at your beautiful girls, look how much we loved each other. And then she murdered them. So it's another way for her to exact callous vengeance against him for seeking custody.
Recording this because Leo and Bear are united. Everything is gone, gone. I hate you. I truly, truly hate you. You didn't care about our babies. You didn't care about me. You care about yourself. All you did was hurt us. You're an evil, horrible man. And I just go into God, because God is the only one who cares and who can protect me. Because you are the devil, Leo. You are the psychotic devil. At least the girls and I will be together in heaven, protected and safe from you.
She ended up taking a handful of pills, and by all accounts, it appears she did not expect to wake up. And this was really her last memorialization of what kind of mom she was and what she wanted to be the narrative. And consistent with what we see with many psychopathic individuals, her need to remain in control of the narrative prevailed right up until the end.
Becoming a parent doesn't stop you from being a psychopath. You can still have psychopathic behaviors and tendencies, no matter what role you have in a family. She manipulated her ex-husband and used their children as pawns. They were her tools, unfortunately, to exact harm against her ex-husband.
There are female killers, and yes, they're very violent, but they are rare. I think that's important to say. 80 to 90% of homicides are committed by men. And the remaining homicides that are committed by women, most of it is in self-defense. That is not true of men.
It's important to focus on cases of women who are psychopaths because it's a cultural blind spot. It helps us remember that there are female psychopaths and there's male psychopaths, and that to be equally protected against both, I think we need to be able to look for those signs and understand how sometimes cultural stereotypes will blind us right away to seeing those signs.
The female psychopath, while it is a seemingly rare population, what we also do know, which is somewhat humbling, is that the female psychopath may go more undetected. What makes them more dangerous is that they blend in. They are upstanding.
April 18th, 2020. The roads of rural Nova Scotia were almost empty. It was the kind of night that seemed incapable of producing history. The kind of quiet spring evening that disappeared unnoticed into memory. A cool breeze drifted through the trees. The last traces of daylight had faded beyond the horizon, leaving behind a darkness broken only by porch lights, distant headlights, and the occasional glow from a farmhouse window. Across the province, families were settling into routines made familiar by the strange reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. People stayed home. Roads were quieter than usual. Communities that were normally connected by visits, gatherings, and conversations now existed behind closed doors. For many residents, the evening felt safe. Ordinary. Forgettable. No one knew that over the next 13 hours, Nova Scotia would become the scene of the deadliest mass murder in modern Canadian history. And even more chilling than the violence itself was the disguise. Because the man responsible would not be hiding from the public. He would be driving directly toward them. Wearing a police uniform. Inside what appeared to be a police vehicle. To the people who saw him, there would be no immediate reason to run. No immediate reason to fear. And for some, that deception would become the final mistake they ever made. When most people imagine danger, they imagine something obvious. A masked intruder. A stranger carrying a weapon. A threat that announces itself. Human beings are wired to search for signs of safety. We trust symbols. We trust uniforms. We trust flashing lights in the darkness. We trust the people society tells us are there to protect us. That trust exists for a reason. It allows communities to function. It allows emergencies to be managed. It allows people to believe that help is coming. But what happens when the symbol of safety becomes the disguise of a killer? What happens when the vehicle pulling into your driveway isn't bringing protection? What happens when the person standing outside your home looks exactly like the person you would call in a crisis? Those questions would haunt Canada long after the shooting ended. Because this was not simply a story about murder. It was a story about trust. And how quickly trust can be weaponized. Hours before the attacks began, the communities scattered across northern Nova Scotia were preparing for another quiet night. Places like Portapique were not the kinds of towns that made international headlines. The landscape was beautiful. Dense forests stretched toward the horizon. Narrow roads wound between homes, cottages, and patches of wilderness. The ocean was never far away. People knew one another. Neighbors recognized vehicles passing through. Children grew up surrounded by familiar faces. Visitors often described the region as peaceful. The sort of place where doors were sometimes left unlocked. The sort of place where strangers stood out. The sort of place where unimaginable violence seemed impossible. Yet beneath that calm surface, another story was unfolding. A story hidden behind closed doors. A story that would eventually erupt into a nightmare stretching across multiple communities. Somewhere in that darkness was a man named Gabriel Wortman. To many people, he appeared successful. He owned a dental prosthetics business. He had money, property, vehicles, the appearance of stability. From a distance, his life looked established, predictable, respectable. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. Those who knew him more closely described a far more complicated figure. Reports that would emerge after the massacre painted a picture of a man capable of controlling behavior, intimidation, and sudden bursts of anger. Investigators would later examine years of troubling allegations and warning signs. Friends, neighbors, former acquaintances. Many would find themselves asking the same devastating question. How much of this was visible before the tragedy? And how much remained hidden until it was too late? As the evening continued, events inside Porter-Peak were moving toward a point of no return. The details would later be reconstructed through witness statements, investigative reports, emergency calls, and survivor accounts. What emerged was a sequence of events that felt less like a conventional crime and more like the opening chapter of a disaster. The violence began with domestic abuse. It started not in a public place, not in a crowded area, but inside a private world hidden from outsiders. A place where fear often exists long before anyone else sees it. At some point that night, an argument escalated. Then violence followed. The woman who survived that encounter would later become one of the most important witnesses in understanding what happened. But in those early moments, there was no way to know that a personal act of violence was about to evolve into something much larger. Something catastrophic. Something that would spread far beyond a single home. Outside, the darkness deepened. Inside neighboring houses, people watched television, talked with family members, prepared for bed, checked their phones, read books, finished late dinners. The ordinary rituals of ordinary lives. No alarms, no warnings, no emergency alerts, no indication that death was moving toward them. Then came fire, then gunshots, then chaos. The first reports were confusing. A structure burning, possible shootings, unclear circumstances. In rural communities, information often travels slowly. People hear fragments before they hear facts. A neighbor sees smoke. Another hears distant bangs. Someone notices emergency vehicles. Nobody yet understands the scale. Nobody yet understands that a killer is moving through the community. And almost nobody understands what he looks like. The darkness worked in his favor. The confusion worked in his favor. The isolation worked in his favor. But above all else, the disguise worked in his favor. Because by the time people learned the truth, many critical hours had already passed. Imagine standing near your window and seeing a police cruiser outside. Imagine feeling concern, but not fear. Perhaps there has been an accident. Perhaps officers are responding to an emergency nearby. Perhaps someone needs assistance. Your instincts would not tell you to hide. Your instincts would tell you that help had arrived. That assumption is exactly what makes this case so disturbing. The uniform was not simply clothing. The vehicle was not simply transportation. Together they created an illusion powerful enough to bypass the most basic human survival instincts. The illusion transformed suspicion into trust. And trust into vulnerability. As the night progressed, houses burned. Lives ended. Entire families were shattered. The violence spread across a landscape that had no idea it had become a hunting ground. Emergency responders struggled to understand what was happening. Information arrived in fragments. Witnesses were frightened. Communication gaps widened. Critical decisions had to be made under immense pressure. Meanwhile, the killer kept moving. Road after road. Community after community. Hour after hour. The attacks did not unfold within minutes. They stretched across an entire night and into the following morning. That fact alone makes the case uniquely horrifying. Many mass shootings are measured in moments. This one was measured in hours. Hours during which people slept. Hours during which families woke up and began normal Sunday routines. Hours during which the threat remained active. Hours during which a man disguised as law enforcement continued traveling through Nova Scotia. Long after the first victims had fallen. Long after the first fires had started. Long after police realized they were dealing with something extraordinary. Dawn eventually began to approach. The darkness that had hidden so much slowly retreated. But daylight did not bring immediate safety. Instead, it revealed the scale of the unfolding nightmare. Smoke rising from damaged properties. Roadblocks. Police activity. Confused residents searching for answers. And somewhere beyond those scenes, the gunman was still alive. Still armed. Still moving. Still dangerous. By the time the violence finally ended, 22 innocent people would be dead. Teachers. Nurses. Parents. Neighbors. Community members. People with plans for the future. People who expected to wake up on April 19th and continue ordinary lives. People who never imagined they would become part of one of Canada's darkest criminal cases. Among them was a police officer who died while trying to stop the threat. Others were killed in homes. Some while helping others. Some while simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each victim left behind families, friends, and unanswered questions. And perhaps the most troubling question of all remained impossible to answer completely. Why? Why did this happen? Why these victims? Why this path of destruction? Why this transformation from private violence to public massacre? Years later, investigators, journalists, psychologists, and survivors would continue searching for clarity. Yet even after extensive investigations, a single simple motive never emerged. Instead, what remained was a tangled picture of grievances, violence, control, resentment, and personal instability. A puzzle missing critical pieces. A nightmare without a satisfying explanation. But before Canada would begin asking those questions, before commissions would examine mistakes, before families would demand accountability, before investigators would reconstruct every movement of the killer, there was only confusion. Only fear. Only uncertainty. And a province waking up to discover that something unimaginable had happened during the night. A tragedy that would alter communities forever. A tragedy that would expose vulnerabilities few people had ever considered. A tragedy that began with a lie. A uniform. A vehicle. A carefully crafted illusion. And behind that illusion stood a man who understood that people are far more likely to open a door for someone they trust than for someone they fear. That trust would become one of the deadliest weapons used during the Nova Scotia mass shooting. And this is the story of how it happened. If you drive through rural Nova Scotia on a calm spring afternoon, it is easy to understand why so many people choose to stay. The landscape seems designed to slow life down. Long stretches of road cut through forests that appear endless. Small communities sit quietly between the trees and the coastline. Houses are separated by distance rather than fences. Neighbors know one another not because they live side by side, but because they have shared years of greetings, favors, community events, and familiar routines. In many places, the ocean is never far away. The smell of salt drifts inland with the wind. Fishing boats move across the water. Seabirds circle overhead. Even silence feels different there. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of space. Nova Scotia has always carried a reputation for being welcoming. The province is built from hundreds of interconnected communities, many of them small enough that residents recognize vehicles passing down local roads. News travels through conversations. Families often remain connected across generations. Children grow up seeing the same faces year after year. For outsiders, it can feel like stepping into a slower version of the modern world. For locals, it is simply home. Porter-Peak was one of those places. Nestled along the northern shore of the province, the community was not large. It was quiet, scenic, and largely removed from the pressures associated with larger urban centers. Visitors often came seeking peace. Residents stayed because they had already found it. The roads winding through Portapique were lined with homes, cottages, wooded lots, and stretches of open land. During the warmer months, seasonal residents arrived to enjoy the beauty of the region. During quieter periods, life settled into predictable rhythms. People worked. Families gathered. Neighbors checked on one another. The community functioned on trust. Trust that people would help if help was needed. Trust that familiar faces remained familiar. Trust that danger belonged somewhere else. That trust had been built over decades. No one could have imagined how quickly it would be shattered. The spring of 2020 was unlike any other period in recent memory. Around the world, uncertainty had become part of everyday life. The COVID-19 pandemic had altered routines everywhere. Schools closed. Businesses adjusted. Travel slowed dramatically. People spent more time at home than they had in years. The atmosphere across Canada felt strange and unfamiliar. Yet despite the anxiety surrounding the pandemic, many smaller communities experienced an unexpected side effect. Life became quieter. Road traffic decreased. Public spaces emptied. Families spent evenings together. For some residents of Nova Scotia, the isolation even created a temporary sense of safety from the chaos unfolding elsewhere in the world. While major cities dominated headlines with rising case numbers and emergency measures, places like Portapique seemed insulated from much of that turmoil. The outside world felt distant. The forests remained. The coastline remained. The familiar roads remained. And on the evening of April 18th, many people were focused on ordinary concerns. Some were planning for the following week. Some were talking with loved ones. Some were watching television. Others were enjoying the simple comfort of a quiet Saturday night. Nothing about the evening suggested that history was approaching. The weather was mild. The darkness arrived gradually. Lights glowed from windows across the community. In homes scattered throughout the area, people settled into routines they had performed hundreds of times before. The predictability of those moments would later become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the tragedy. Because ordinary moments are invisible while they are happening. No one realizes they are living their final normal evening. No one pauses to appreciate the final casual conversation. The final dinner. The final phone call. The final goodnight. Only afterward do those moments become precious. Only afterward do they gain meaning. Across Nova Scotia, thousands of families were experiencing those ordinary moments. They had no reason to believe anything else. At the same time, another story existed beneath the surface. A story that few people could fully see. The story of Gabriel Wortman was not the story many outsiders initially assumed. When news organizations first began reporting details after the massacre, one question emerged immediately. Who was he? How could someone carry out violence on such a scale? The public searched for answers. What investigators eventually uncovered was a complicated picture. Wortman was not a drifter. He was not someone living completely outside society. He operated a successful dental prosthetics business. He owned property. He had financial resources. To many casual observers, he appeared established. The image projected outward was one of success. A person with a career. A person with assets. A person who appeared to have built a stable life. But public appearances often conceal private realities. As investigators examined his history, a different portrait slowly emerged. Reports described allegations of controlling behavior. Accounts of intimidation. Stories of anger. Stories of fear. Stories that, taken individually, may not have seemed capable of predicting a future mass murderer. Yet after the tragedy, people began looking backward through every available detail. Human beings do this after disasters. We search the past for warning signs. We search for clues that might explain the present. Sometimes those clues exist. Sometimes they do not. And sometimes they exist but remain scattered, disconnected, and unnoticed until everything is over. People who encountered Wortman in different contexts often described different versions of the same man. Some knew him professionally, others socially. Some interacted with him only occasionally. The result was a collection of impressions rather than a single consistent identity. This complexity would become one of the defining features of the case. Mass violence often creates a desire for simple explanations. People want a clear motive, a clear reason, a clear answer. The reality is often far messier. Long before April 2020, there were indications that parts of Wortman's life were marked by instability and troubling behavior. Yet those signs existed within a larger context that allowed him to continue functioning outwardly as a successful member of the community. This contradiction would later frustrate investigators and researchers alike. How does someone maintain normal appearances while carrying such darkness beneath the surface? The answer is rarely simple. Many dangerous individuals do not appear dangerous all the time. They move through ordinary environments. They participate in ordinary activities. They build relationships. They create routines. And because of that, the eventual eruption of violence feels impossible until it happens. As April 18th unfolded, nobody in Porter-Peak could see the full picture. Nobody knew what was building. Nobody knew how close the community stood to catastrophe. The roads remained quiet. The houses remained illuminated. The forests remained still. And hidden within that peaceful setting was a danger that had not yet revealed itself. The geography of the area would soon play an important role in the unfolding events. Unlike dense urban neighborhoods, rural communities create unique challenges during emergencies. Homes are often separated by significant distances. Road networks can be limited. Communication may depend heavily on mobile coverage, local knowledge, and response times. When something goes wrong, help is not always immediately around the corner. People learn to rely on themselves. They learn to rely on neighbors. And they learn to rely on trust. Trust that emergency responders will arrive when needed. Trust that warnings will spread quickly. Trust that systems designed for public safety will function when the worst occurs. Those assumptions are usually reasonable. Most days, they are correct. But disasters expose weaknesses that remain invisible during normal times. The events that were about to unfold would reveal several such weaknesses. Not all of them involved the killer. Some involved communication. Some involved timing. Some involved decisions made under extraordinary pressure. Those issues would become central to the national conversation after the massacre ended. Yet on the evening itself, none of those debates existed. There was only normal life. The kind of normal life that never expects to become part of a true crime story. Children slept. Couples relaxed. Neighbors carried on with routines. The world felt predictable. Safe. Stable. The contrast between that peaceful setting and the violence that followed would become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. Because evil did not arrive in a city already accustomed to danger. It arrived in a community that believed it was far removed from it. It arrived where people expected kindness. Where they expected familiarity. Where they expected trust. And perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate years later. The massacre was not simply an attack on individuals. It was an attack on assumptions. The assumption that rural communities are protected by their isolation. The assumption that familiar surroundings guarantee safety. The assumption that danger is always recognizable when it appears. By the time those assumptions were challenged, it was already too late. The night was coming. The darkness was settling over Porter-Peak. Lights glowed in windows across the community. People prepared for sleep. The forests stood silent beneath the spring sky. And somewhere within that silence, the first pieces of a tragedy were already moving into place. A tragedy that would leave 22 people dead. A tragedy that would shock an entire nation. A tragedy whose consequences would stretch far beyond one community, one province, or one night. But before the gunfire. Before the fires. Before the police pursuit. Before the headlines, there was simply Nova Scotia. Beautiful, quiet, trusting, and completely unaware of what was about to begin. When people talk about mass murder cases, there is a tendency for one name to dominate the narrative. The killer's name appears in headlines. The killer's photograph is shown repeatedly. The killer's history becomes the focus of endless analysis. But the true center of every tragedy is not the person who caused it. It is the people whose lives were taken away. In the case of the Nova Scotia massacre, 22 individuals lost their lives. 22 separate stories. 22 separate futures. 22 separate circles of family, friendship, memory, and love that would never be the same again. The number itself is difficult to comprehend. 22. It sounds almost abstract when spoken aloud. But numbers do not laugh. Numbers do not raise children. Numbers do not sit across the dinner table. Numbers do not answer phone calls. People do. And behind every victim was a life that existed long before April 18, 2020. Lives filled with routines, ambitions, disappointments, celebrations, and ordinary moments that rarely make the news. The victims came from different backgrounds, different professions, different generations. Some worked in healthcare. Some worked in education. Some had retired after decades of labor. Some were active members of their communities. Some were known for helping neighbors. Some were known simply for being kind. Many of them had spent years building lives in the very communities where they would eventually lose them. That is one of the most painful realities of this case. These were not strangers gathered by coincidence in a single location. They were members of interconnected communities. People whose lives had become woven into the fabric of Nova Scotia. People who belonged. In the days after the massacre, family photographs began appearing across television screens and newspaper pages. Smiling faces. Vacation pictures. Family celebrations. Wedding photographs. Snapshots taken during happier times. The images all shared something in common. None of them looked like victims. Because victims never do. They look like people living ordinary lives. People making plans for next week. People expecting tomorrow to arrive. People who have absolutely no idea that history is approaching their front door. Some of the victims had spent years helping others. One worked in healthcare, dedicating countless hours to caring for people during vulnerable moments of their lives. Another devoted years to education, helping students learn, grow, and prepare for futures they could not yet imagine. Others worked quietly without public recognition. They built businesses, maintained homes, supported families, contributed to communities in ways that rarely attract attention. Yet those contributions matter. Communities are not built by famous people alone. They are built by ordinary people performing thousands of small acts of responsibility and kindness over decades. Those acts create neighborhoods. Those acts create trust. Those acts create home. The massacre destroyed lives, but it also damaged something larger. It damaged the sense of security that connected those communities together. For surviving families, grief arrived in waves. First came confusion. Then disbelief. Then the desperate hope that somehow the information was wrong. Human beings are remarkably resistant to accepting catastrophic news. The mind searches for alternatives. There must be a mistake. There must be a misunderstanding. The report must be incomplete. Perhaps someone else was involved. Perhaps they survived. Perhaps there is another explanation. But eventually reality arrives. And when it does, it often arrives all at once. A phone call. A knock at the door. A confirmation from authorities. A sentence that permanently divides life into two parts. Before and after. For many families, April 2020 became that dividing line. The final conversations suddenly became precious memories. The final text messages became treasured possessions. The final embraces became moments replayed endlessly in the mind. People often imagine grief as a dramatic event. Something loud. Something visible. But much of grief happens quietly. It happens when someone reaches for a phone before remembering there is nobody to call. It happens when birthdays arrive. When holidays return. When familiar songs begin playing unexpectedly. When an empty chair remains empty. Those moments would become part of life for dozens of families connected to the tragedy. As investigators worked to understand the violence, loved ones were trying to understand absence. Absence is a strange thing. You cannot see it. You cannot touch it. Yet it changes everything around it. A missing voice changes a household. A missing parent changes a family. A missing friend changes an entire social circle. The effects spread outward like ripples across water. One life touches another. Then another. Then another. By the time those ripples finish spreading, entire communities have been transformed. That is exactly what happened in Nova Scotia. The victims represented different ages and different walks of life, but they shared one thing. None of them expected to become part of a mass casualty event. Some were spending a quiet evening at home. Some were with loved ones. Some were following routines they had followed countless times before. The ordinary nature of those moments makes the tragedy even harder to process. There was no warning that adequately communicated the danger. No clear indication of what was coming. No opportunity for many of them to understand the threat before it arrived. And that threat often appeared in a form that seemed trustworthy. That detail would become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. Trust is a powerful force in small communities. People trust familiar roads. They trust familiar faces. They trust emergency services. They trust symbols associated with safety. The killer exploited that trust. For some victims, the appearance of a police vehicle would not have triggered fear. It may have triggered concern, curiosity, a desire to understand what was happening. In a normal world, those reactions would have been reasonable. In a normal world, they would have been safe. But this was not a normal situation. And the consequences were devastating. Among those killed was RCMP officer Heidi Stevenson. Her death would become one of the most widely recognized losses associated with the tragedy. Stevenson had devoted years of her life to law enforcement. She was a wife, a mother, a colleague, a public servant. When the crisis unfolded, she responded as officers are trained to do. Toward danger. Not away from it. The details surrounding her death would later become a symbol of both courage and sacrifice. Yet even that recognition cannot fully capture the personal loss experienced by those who knew her best. Public memorials tell one story. Families live another. For every public tribute, there are private memories. Conversations. Shared experiences. Moments that never appear in official reports. The same is true for every victim in this case. Behind each name was a world invisible to the public. Favorite songs. Family traditions. Personal dreams. Future plans. Small habits that only loved ones noticed. Those details rarely survive historical summaries. Yet they are the details that define a person. Not the circumstances of death, but the experiences of life. In the months following the massacre, communities across Nova Scotia searched for ways to honor those who had been lost. Memorials appeared. Flowers accumulated. Messages of support arrived from across Canada and beyond. People who had never met the victims felt connected to the tragedy because they recognized something universal within it. The victims looked like their own neighbors, their own relatives, their own friends. There was nothing extraordinary about them in the celebrity sense. And that was precisely why the losses felt so personal. The victims represented ordinary people living ordinary lives. The kind of people every community depends upon. The kind of people every community contains. The kind of people whose absence is felt long after headlines disappear. As time passed, the public conversation often shifted toward questions of policing, communication failures, emergency alerts, and motive. Those questions were important. Necessary, even. But beneath every debate remained a simple truth. 22 people never came home. 22 lives ended. 22 stories stopped in the middle of sentences that would never be finished. Families continued moving through anniversaries, birthdays, graduations, holidays, moments that should have included someone who was no longer there. That reality cannot be measured by statistics. It cannot be fully expressed through official reports. It exists in the quiet spaces left behind. The empty seats. The unanswered calls. The photographs that suddenly become priceless. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember before examining the violence itself. Before discussing timelines, investigations, and suspects. Before analyzing failures and decisions. Before asking why. We must first remember who paid the price. Because true crime is not ultimately about killers. It is about consequences. And the greatest consequence of the Nova Scotia massacre was not the death of the gunman. It was the loss of 22 innocent lives. Lives that mattered long before the tragedy. Lives that mattered during it. And lives that continue to matter long after the world moved on to other headlines. As darkness settled over Porter-Peak on the evening of April 18, 2020, those 22 people were still living their ordinary lives. Some were relaxing at home. Some were speaking with loved ones. Some were preparing for another day. None of them knew they were only hours away from becoming part of a story that would shock an entire nation. And none of them could have imagined the nightmare that was already beginning to unfold. The evening of April 18, 2020 did not begin as a massacre. It began behind closed doors. Like many tragedies, the first moments unfolded away from public view, hidden inside a private conflict that few outsiders could see. Outside, Porter-Peak remained peaceful. The last traces of daylight had disappeared beyond the horizon. A cool spring darkness settled across the community. Lights glowed warmly through windows. Televisions flickered in living rooms. Families finished late conversations. Some residents were already preparing for bed. Nothing about the night felt unusual. Nothing suggested that the next 13 hours would become one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. At some point during the evening, an argument erupted inside Gabriel Wortman's property. Investigators would later determine that violence was directed toward his common-law partner. What happened during those moments would become critically important because her survival would eventually help authorities reconstruct the beginning of the attack. But in real time, nobody outside that immediate situation understood what was happening. Neighbors did not know. Friends did not know. The community did not know. The darkness concealed everything. As the situation escalated, something changed. The violence that began in private no longer remained contained. It expanded. What happened next transformed a domestic assault into a mass casualty event. The transition was terrifyingly fast. One moment, Porter-Peak was a quiet coastal community. The next, it was becoming the center of an unfolding nightmare. Investigators later concluded that Wortman began moving through the area armed with multiple firearms. The first victims were encountered within the community itself. Some were neighbors. Some were people who had known one another for years. Some likely had no idea that danger was approaching until it was already upon them. The isolation of the community worked in favor of the attacker. Homes were separated by stretches of road and wooded areas. People could not easily see what was happening beyond their own properties. Information traveled slowly. Confusion spread quickly. Meanwhile, another element of the attack was beginning to emerge. Fire. Several structures were deliberately set ablaze. Before long, flames were rising into the night sky. Orange light reflected off nearby trees. Smoke drifted across the darkness. For some residents, the first indication that something was wrong may not have been gunfire at all. It may have been the glow of a fire where no fire should have existed. The sight of emergency vehicles would normally bring reassurance. But this situation was anything but normal. As houses burned, emergency calls began reaching dispatchers. The information arriving was fragmented. A fire. Possible gunshots. Unclear circumstances. Conflicting reports. The full scale of the event remained hidden. Even authorities struggled to understand what they were facing. Mass casualty incidents often create information gaps during the earliest stages. Witnesses see only portions of the larger picture. One person observes smoke. Another hears loud noises. Someone else notices unusual activity down the road. No single individual understands everything. The same pattern was unfolding in Porter-Peak. And while confusion dominated among residents and responders, the attacker already possessed one enormous advantage: preparation. This was not a spontaneous flight from the scene. Investigators would later discover evidence suggesting significant planning had occurred before the attacks. One of the most shocking elements involved the disguise. Wortman was not a police officer. Yet he possessed clothing that closely resembled an RCMP uniform. Even more disturbing, he had access to a vehicle that had been modified to look remarkably similar to an RCMP cruiser. In daylight, the resemblance was alarming. At night, amid confusion and fear, it became even more powerful. The disguise fundamentally changed the nature of the threat. Most active killers attempt to avoid law enforcement. This attacker chose to imitate it. That decision would have devastating consequences. Trust is one of the strongest instincts within any community. People are taught from childhood that police officers represent safety. When citizens encounter law enforcement during emergencies, they often move toward them rather than away. The uniform carries authority. The vehicle carries legitimacy. Together they create immediate assumptions. The attacker exploited those assumptions. As the night continued, residents were forced into impossible situations. Imagine looking outside and seeing what appears to be a police vehicle. Imagine believing help has arrived. Imagine believing authorities are responding to reports of fire or danger. That belief would have been completely reasonable. Yet on this night, appearances could not be trusted. Hours passed. The violence continued. The attacker moved through the area while authorities attempted to understand the scope of the emergency. Some survivors later described confusion more than anything else. They struggled to determine where the danger was located. They struggled to understand whether the threat remained active. They struggled to separate rumor from reality. Fear grows rapidly when information is incomplete. Every distant light becomes suspicious. Every sound demands attention. Every passing vehicle raises questions. For residents sheltering inside their homes, uncertainty became its own form of terror. Throughout the community, emergency responders faced a rapidly evolving situation. The geography complicated everything. Porter-Peak was not a densely populated urban center. The landscape consisted of winding roads, wooded areas, and properties separated by significant distances. Searching such an environment in darkness created enormous challenges. Visibility was limited. Information remained incomplete. The attacker possessed local knowledge. Responders were attempting to assemble a picture while the situation continued changing. Meanwhile, the fires burned. Smoke drifted upward into the night sky. Flames illuminated sections of the community. The destruction was becoming visible even before its full meaning could be understood. For families elsewhere in Nova Scotia, however, life continued normally. Most had no idea that a mass killing was underway. Many slept peacefully. Others watched late-night television. Some prepared for work the following morning. The contrast was extraordinary. In one community, chaos and fear were spreading. Elsewhere, the province remained unaware. The night gradually advanced toward morning. But unlike many violent incidents, this tragedy did not conclude quickly. It continued. Hour after hour. That prolonged timeline remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Many mass shootings unfold over minutes. This attack stretched across an entire night and into the following day. The length of the event created opportunities for the danger to spread beyond its original location. And that is exactly what happened. Eventually, the attacker left Porter-Peak. The violence expanded beyond the community where it had begun. The threat was now mobile. That distinction changed everything. A stationary crime scene can be contained. A moving offender creates an entirely different challenge. Roads become potential pathways. New communities become vulnerable. Every passing mile introduces new uncertainty. As dawn approached on April 19th, the darkness that had concealed so much began to retreat. The first light of morning revealed a province waking to fragmented reports of something terrible. Smoke. Emergency vehicles. Road closures. Police activity. Rumors. Questions. Yet even as daylight arrived, the danger had not ended. The attacker remained active. Armed. Mobile. And disguised. That disguise continued to complicate the situation. People encountering what appeared to be a police vehicle could not automatically know whether it was genuine. The distinction between safety and danger had become blurred. The symbol people trusted most had been weaponized. As the morning progressed, additional victims were encountered across multiple locations. Lives intersected with the attacker for different reasons. Some happened to cross his path. Others encountered him during the unfolding crisis. The attacks appeared less like a single event and more like a moving trail of devastation stretching across rural Nova Scotia. With each passing hour, authorities gained a clearer understanding of the scale of the emergency. The realization was horrifying. This was not an isolated shooting. This was not a contained incident. This was a province-wide manhunt involving an armed individual who had already demonstrated extraordinary violence. The urgency increased. Police resources expanded. Efforts intensified to locate the suspect before more lives could be lost. Yet the clock continued moving forward. And so did the attacker. For residents receiving bits and pieces of information, uncertainty remained overwhelming. Many people did not immediately know where the suspect was. Many did not know what vehicle to watch for. Many did not yet understand the significance of the police disguise. The information environment remained chaotic. In crises, timing matters. Minutes matter. Communication matters. Every delay can influence decisions made by ordinary people attempting to protect themselves and their families. These realities would later become central issues in public discussions surrounding the case. But during the incident itself, survival remained the priority. People sought safety. Families contacted loved ones. Communities attempted to make sense of a situation unlike anything they had ever experienced. By late morning, the manhunt was nearing its conclusion. Authorities had gathered increasing amounts of information regarding the suspect's movements. Officers continued searching. Roadways remained under scrutiny. Tensions stretched across the province. Then, at a gas station in Enfield, the final chapter of the attack unfolded. After more than 12 hours of violence, the suspect encountered police officers. The confrontation that followed ended the manhunt. Gabriel Wortman was shot and killed by responding officers. The immediate threat was over. The movement stopped. The pursuit ended. The violence ceased. But the tragedy itself was only beginning. Because once the danger disappeared, the full scale of what had happened became impossible to ignore. 22 innocent people were dead. Multiple communities had been affected. Homes had been destroyed. Families had been shattered. An entire province struggled to understand how such devastation could unfold over such a long period of time. The fires would eventually burn out. The police vehicles would eventually leave. The roads would eventually reopen. But nothing would return to the way it had been before. The quiet spring night that began with ordinary routines had ended as a national tragedy. And as investigators arrived to piece together the timeline, a new phase of the story was about to begin. The shooting was over. The questions were not. The violence had ended. The gunman was dead. The immediate threat that had terrorized Nova Scotia for more than 12 hours was finally gone. Yet for investigators, emergency responders, and grieving families, the most difficult reality was only beginning to emerge. Because ending a massacre and understanding a massacre are two very different things. On the morning of April 19, 2020, police officers, firefighters, forensic specialists, and emergency personnel faced a task unlike anything most of them had encountered in their careers. They needed to reconstruct a nightmare that had unfolded across multiple locations, multiple communities, and multiple crime scenes. And before they could understand why it happened, they first had to determine exactly what had happened. That process began with silence. Not the peaceful silence that had once defined Porter-Peak. A different silence. The silence that follows catastrophe. Roads that should have carried ordinary weekend traffic were now occupied by emergency vehicles. Police tape marked areas where investigators needed to preserve evidence. Fire-damaged structures stood blackened against the morning sky. Smoke still lingered in some locations. The landscape itself appeared wounded. For residents emerging from hours of fear and uncertainty, the sight was almost impossible to process. Many people had spent the night receiving fragments of information. Rumors. Warnings. Social media updates. Phone calls from worried relatives. Now daylight exposed what darkness had concealed. The scale. The destruction. The human cost. Investigators quickly recognized a central challenge. This was not one crime scene. It was many. Every location connected to the attack potentially contained critical evidence. Every burned structure. Every vehicle. Every roadway. Every witness statement. Every emergency call. Each represented a piece of a much larger puzzle. The first responders who entered those scenes were not searching for a mystery in the traditional sense. The identity of the attacker was already known. The suspect was dead. There would be no future arrest. No lengthy manhunt. No hidden killer waiting to be identified. Yet the investigation remained extraordinarily complex. Authorities still needed answers. Families needed answers. Communities needed answers. Canada needed answers. One of the earliest priorities involved documenting the sequence of events. That proved far more difficult than it might appear. The attacks had stretched across roughly 13 hours. The offender had traveled through multiple locations. Witnesses had observed only fragments of the overall timeline. Some had seen smoke. Others had heard gunfire. Others had encountered police activity without fully understanding its purpose. Many people were describing the same event from entirely different perspectives. Investigators began gathering those perspectives one by one. Every conversation mattered. Every recollection mattered. Sometimes the smallest detail helped establish a timeline. A vehicle seen at a certain moment. A phone call received at a specific time. A light observed in the distance. A conversation remembered hours later. Investigations often advance through dramatic discoveries in movies and television. Reality is usually slower. More methodical. More patient. Truth emerges piece by piece. And in Nova Scotia, there were many pieces to collect. The burned properties became especially important. Fire destroys. That is its nature. It consumes evidence. Alters environments. Changes scenes before investigators can fully examine them. The attacker had not only committed murder. He had also set fires. As a result, forensic teams faced the dual challenge of investigating both violent crime scenes and fire scenes. Each location required careful documentation. Each location required specialists. Each location required time. Meanwhile, families waited. Across Nova Scotia, loved ones searched desperately for information. Some already feared the worst. Others still clung to hope. The period following a mass casualty event is often marked by agonizing uncertainty. Authorities must confirm identities. Notify next of kin. Verify facts. Avoid mistakes. Those procedures exist for important reasons. But for families trapped between hope and grief, every passing hour can feel unbearable. The emotional impact spread rapidly throughout the province. Small communities often possess deep social connections. A single victim may be known by dozens or hundreds of people. A tragedy affecting 22 victims reaches far beyond 22 households. Friends grieved. Co-workers grieved. Neighbors grieved. Entire networks of people suddenly found themselves connected by loss. As investigators continued processing scenes, another realization became increasingly significant. The disguise had played a major role in the attack. Evidence confirmed that the gunman had been dressed in clothing resembling an RCMP uniform. Investigators also documented the vehicle modified to resemble a police cruiser. Photographs of the vehicle would later shock much of the public. The resemblance was striking. What initially sounded unbelievable became undeniable. The deception had been real. And it raised troubling questions. How had the disguise been assembled? How long had it existed? What role had it played in the offender's movements? Had it influenced the decisions of victims? These questions would become central to understanding the tragedy. Investigators also examined the firearms involved. Authorities sought to determine where the weapons originated, how they had been obtained, and whether any laws had been violated during the acquisition process. Those inquiries would eventually extend beyond the immediate timeline of the massacre itself. Understanding a mass casualty event often requires looking backward. Far backward. Investigators are rarely satisfied with knowing what happened. They want to know how it became possible. That distinction matters. A timeline explains actions. A deeper investigation seeks causes. As forensic teams worked through evidence, another challenge emerged. The public wanted information. Immediately. In the modern world, major tragedies generate enormous demand for answers. News organizations seek updates. Citizens seek reassurance. Families seek clarity. Social media accelerates all of those pressures. Yet investigators frequently possess incomplete information during the earliest stages. Announcing conclusions too quickly can create errors. Waiting too long can create frustration. Balancing those realities is never easy. In Nova Scotia, public attention grew rapidly. The death toll continued to evolve as authorities verified information. Each update carried additional weight. Each confirmation represented another life lost. Another family devastated. Another chapter added to an already overwhelming tragedy. As investigators mapped the offender's route, the sheer geographical scope of the attacks became increasingly apparent. The violence had not remained confined to one location. Instead, it stretched across a significant area. Every new scene reinforced the same reality. This was not an impulsive outburst lasting a few minutes. It was an extended series of attacks unfolding over many hours. That fact alone distinguished the case from many other mass killings. The duration created opportunities for intervention. Opportunities for communication. Opportunities that would later become subjects of intense scrutiny. At the time, however, investigators remained focused on establishing facts. Facts before theories. Facts before blame. Facts before conclusions. That process required enormous effort. Witness interviews expanded. Evidence inventories grew. Digital records were examined. Emergency communications were reviewed. Investigators essentially reconstructed the entire event minute by minute. The resulting picture was disturbing. The more clearly authorities understood the timeline, the more questions emerged. Questions about preparation. Questions about motive. Questions about warning signs. Questions about decision-making during the crisis. Many of those questions did not yet have answers. Some would take months to investigate. Others would take years. Some would never be answered completely. One particularly important witness helped investigators understand the earliest stages of the violence. The gunman's surviving partner became a critical source of information regarding events before the attacks spread throughout the community. Her survival provided investigators with insight into the beginning of the tragedy that otherwise might have been lost forever. Without survivors, crucial moments often disappear into uncertainty. With survivors, investigators gain windows into events that cannot be observed through physical evidence alone. As evidence accumulated, another uncomfortable reality became impossible to ignore. The massacre was not simply a story about one man's violence. It was also becoming a story about systems. Communication systems. Emergency response systems. Public warning systems. The initial focus remained on documenting the crimes themselves. But already, questions were beginning to surface regarding how information had been shared during the crisis. Those questions would eventually grow much larger. For now, however, investigators continued their work. Photographs were taken. Evidence was catalogued. Witnesses were interviewed. Timelines were refined. And throughout it all, communities struggled to absorb what had happened. The emotional atmosphere across Nova Scotia was difficult to describe. Shock remained everywhere. People searched for explanations that did not yet exist. How could something like this happen here? How could a quiet community become the scene of such devastation? How could a man travel for hours while carrying out acts of violence? And perhaps most hauntingly, how could someone disguise himself as a symbol of public safety? The answers were not yet available. Not fully. But investigators were getting closer. Every crime scene documented. Every statement collected. Every piece of evidence preserved. Together they formed the foundation of a much larger inquiry. An inquiry that would eventually move beyond the physical evidence and into something even more complicated. The investigation itself. Because while the discovery phase revealed what had happened, it also exposed how many unanswered questions still remained. And those questions were about to lead investigators into the most controversial chapter of the entire case. In many criminal investigations, detectives begin with a simple question. Who did it? In Nova Scotia, that question had already been answered. The gunman was dead. His identity was known. His movements had begun to emerge through witness accounts and forensic evidence. There would be no dramatic arrest. No interrogation room confession. No courtroom battle over guilt or innocence. Yet despite knowing who carried out the massacre, investigators quickly realized they were facing a mystery of a different kind. A mystery built not around identity, but around understanding. Why had this happened? How had it become possible? And perhaps most importantly, could it have been prevented? Those questions transformed what might have been a straightforward homicide investigation into one of the most complex inquiries in Canadian history. The public often imagines investigations as a straight road leading toward truth. Reality is rarely that simple. Reality resembles a maze. Every answer creates new questions. Every discovery reveals another missing piece. Every lead opens multiple directions. The Nova Scotia massacre was no exception. In the days following the attack, investigators found themselves examining not only the movements of the killer but the years that came before the violence. Mass killings rarely emerge from a vacuum. They are usually preceded by histories, patterns, relationships, grievances, and warning signs. The challenge is determining which of those elements matter. Human beings leave traces of themselves everywhere. Conversations. Arguments. Financial records. Social interactions. Personal habits. Digital footprints. Most of those traces prove meaningless. Some become critically important. The task facing investigators was separating one from the other. As interviews expanded, a more complicated portrait of Gabriel Wortman began to emerge. To the outside world, he had often appeared successful. He owned property. He operated a business. He projected an image of stability. Yet behind that image, investigators encountered allegations that painted a far darker picture. Stories surfaced describing controlling behavior. Stories involving intimidation. Stories involving anger that could appear suddenly and leave lasting impressions on those who experienced it. None of these accounts alone explained a massacre. But together they suggested a man who had been living with unresolved instability for years. The challenge was determining how those pieces fit together. Some people who knew him expressed shock. Others were less surprised. That contrast itself became significant. After major crimes, communities frequently divide into two groups. Those who never saw it coming, and those who later say they noticed warning signs. The difficulty is that warning signs often appear obvious only after tragedy occurs. Viewed in isolation, troubling incidents can seem disconnected. Viewed after catastrophe, they suddenly form patterns. Investigators had to resist the temptation of hindsight. They needed facts, not assumptions. Evidence, not theories. And there were plenty of theories. The absence of a clear motive created a vacuum. Whenever a vacuum exists, speculation rushes in. Some people believed the attacks were carefully planned acts of revenge. Others believed they reflected years of accumulated anger. Some searched for political motivations. Others looked for financial explanations, psychological explanations, personal explanations, community explanations. Theories multiplied rapidly, yet investigators remained cautious. One of the most frustrating realities of criminal investigation is that motives are often less satisfying than people expect. There is a tendency to believe horrific acts must be driven by equally dramatic explanations. Sometimes that is true. Often it is not. Sometimes violence emerges from a tangled mixture of resentment, control, grievance, fantasy, and personal instability that refuses to fit into a single category. The deeper investigators looked into Wortman's life, the more complicated the picture became. Another major area of inquiry focused on preparation. The disguise immediately attracted attention. It was impossible to ignore. The police-style uniform. The replica cruiser. The deliberate effort to resemble law enforcement. Those details raised disturbing questions. How long had he possessed these items? How much planning had gone into creating them? Was the disguise intended for the attacks from the beginning? Or had it evolved over time? Investigators examined photographs, records, witness accounts, and physical evidence in an effort to reconstruct the development of the deception. The more they learned, the more unsettling it became. Because the disguise represented more than appearance. It represented strategy. The uniform was not random. The vehicle was not random. Both served a purpose. Both exploited trust. And both gave the attacker advantages that ordinary offenders rarely possess. As investigators analyzed the timeline, they also examined the weapons involved. Questions arose regarding acquisition, transportation, storage, and legality. Where had the firearms come from? How had they entered his possession? Could intervention have occurred earlier? The answers required cooperation between multiple agencies and extensive evidence review. At the same time, another investigation was beginning to unfold parallel to the criminal inquiry. This second investigation focused not on the gunman, but on the response. And this is where the story became increasingly controversial. During the massacre, information had not reached the public through the emergency alert system. Instead, much of the communication occurred through social media updates and traditional police messaging. After the attack ended, many people began asking difficult questions. Why had broader alerts not been issued earlier? Why had residents not been warned more aggressively? Why had critical information about the suspect's police disguise not reached more people sooner? These questions were emotionally charged because they touched upon something impossible to measure. Lost opportunities. Whenever tragedy occurs, people naturally wonder whether different decisions might have produced different outcomes. Investigators examining emergency response procedures faced that painful reality. Every timeline was scrutinized. Every communication reviewed. Every decision analyzed. The process was not about assigning instant blame. It was about understanding what happened. Yet understanding often reveals uncomfortable truths. As public pressure increased, journalists began conducting investigations of their own. News organizations interviewed witnesses, examined documents, reconstructed timelines, compared official statements. The result was a growing national conversation. People were no longer discussing only the killer. They were discussing systems, preparedness, communication, accountability. Meanwhile, official investigators continued their painstaking work. Thousands of documents accumulated. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Evidence from numerous locations required examination. The scope was enormous. And throughout the process, one reality remained stubbornly unchanged. No single explanation fully accounted for the massacre. Investigators could identify factors. They could identify behaviors. They could identify warning signs. But no discovery provided the simple answer many people hoped to find. That ambiguity frustrated both the public and professionals. Human beings prefer stories with clear causes. A leads to B. B leads to C. Crime solved. Case closed. The Nova Scotia massacre resisted that simplicity. Instead, investigators encountered layers. Personal history. Domestic violence. Preparation. Deception. Opportunity. Failures in communication. Failures in recognition. Each layer contributed something. None explained everything. The investigation also forced authorities to confront difficult questions about domestic violence. Many experts noted that the attacks began with violence directed toward an intimate partner. That fact mattered. Again and again, researchers studying mass violence have identified connections between domestic abuse and broader acts of public violence. The pattern is not universal, but it appears often enough to demand attention. As investigators explored Wortman's past, concerns regarding previous behavior toward partners and others became increasingly significant. Those concerns shifted part of the conversation toward prevention. Could warning signs have been recognized earlier? Could intervention have occurred sooner? Could lives have been saved? These questions carried enormous emotional weight because they pointed toward the future as much as the past. The purpose of investigation is not only to explain tragedy. It is also to reduce the chances of repetition. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And still the inquiry continued. What initially appeared to be a completed case evolved into a national examination of multiple systems. Law enforcement procedures. Emergency alerts. Firearms access. Domestic violence awareness. Interagency communication. Public safety protocols. The investigation had become larger than the gunman himself. Yet despite its scale, one truth remained constant. At the center of every document, every interview, every review, and every public hearing stood 22 victims. 22 lives that could not be restored. 22 families living with permanent loss. Every question ultimately led back to them. Every finding existed because of them. Every lesson carried meaning because of them. As investigators pushed deeper into evidence and analysis, they gradually approached a moment that would redefine public understanding of the case. A moment when scattered pieces would begin fitting together. A moment when years of questions would finally receive at least some answers. Not all of them. Perhaps not even most of them. But enough to expose failures, reveal truths, and force an entire country to confront uncomfortable realities. The breakthrough was coming. And with it would arrive the most consequential findings of the entire investigation. For nearly everyone affected by the Nova Scotia massacre, the first months after the tragedy felt like living inside a fog. The violence itself had ended. The killer was dead. The crime scenes had been secured. The victims had been identified. Yet closure remained nowhere in sight. Questions lingered in every corner of the story. Families wanted answers. Communities wanted answers. The public wanted answers. And investigators, despite thousands of hours of work, still faced a difficult reality. Understanding what happened was not the same as understanding why it happened. Nor was it the same as understanding whether some of the deaths could have been prevented. As the investigation expanded, evidence continued accumulating. Witness interviews filled thousands of pages. Communication records were examined. Dispatch logs were reviewed. Timelines were reconstructed minute by minute. What initially appeared to be a straightforward effort to document a mass killing gradually evolved into something much larger. The investigation was no longer focused solely on Gabriel Wortman. It was beginning to examine the environment around him. The systems that responded to him. The warnings that existed before him. And the decisions made while the attacks were unfolding. That shift marked a turning point. Because the deeper investigators looked, the more they discovered that the massacre was not simply a story about one man carrying out violence. It was also a story about missed opportunities, fragmented information, and vulnerabilities hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The breakthrough did not arrive in the form of a single dramatic revelation. There was no forgotten witness suddenly appearing. No secret recording. No confession waiting to be uncovered. Instead, the breakthrough emerged through accumulation. Piece after piece. Document after document. Interview after interview. Like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom, the larger picture gradually became visible. One of the most significant discoveries involved the extent of preparation behind the attacks. In the earliest days after the massacre, many people wondered whether the violence had been impulsive. Perhaps a sudden eruption of rage. Perhaps a spontaneous breakdown. But the evidence increasingly suggested something more troubling. Preparation had occurred long before April 18. The replica police vehicle was not something assembled overnight. The uniform was not an accident. The equipment involved required planning, effort, and intention. The significance of that realization was enormous. Planning changes how investigators understand a crime. A spontaneous act of violence and a prepared act of violence raise different questions. Preparation forces investigators to ask how long the offender had been moving toward that moment. How many opportunities existed for intervention? How many warning signs appeared before the violence began? As evidence continued to emerge, investigators discovered additional information regarding the offender's history. Accounts describing controlling behavior and domestic violence became increasingly important. These reports helped establish a broader context surrounding the attacks. The massacre had not emerged from nowhere. It existed within a longer pattern. That pattern did not predict the future with certainty. Few things ever do. But it revealed a history of behavior that appeared far more troubling when viewed through the lens of what eventually occurred. For many observers, this became one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Warning signs often look different before tragedy than they do afterward. After a disaster, patterns become obvious. Before a disaster, they often appear scattered and disconnected. The breakthrough was not simply discovering that warning signs existed. It was recognizing how many different pieces had existed simultaneously without forming a complete picture. Another critical development emerged from the reconstruction of the attack timeline. Investigators mapped the offender's movements in extraordinary detail. Road by road. Location by location. Minute by minute. As the timeline became clearer, an uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. The attacks unfolded over an unusually long period of time. Hours passed between the first acts of violence and the final confrontation. That duration mattered. It mattered because time creates opportunities. Time allows information to spread. Time allows warnings to be issued. Time allows decisions to influence outcomes. As investigators examined communication records, public attention increasingly shifted toward the response. Specifically, how information was shared during the crisis. This would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Many residents learned about the danger through fragmented channels. Social media posts. Phone calls. Personal messages. Word of mouth. But the broader emergency alert system was not immediately used to warn the public about the active threat. The significance of that fact grew larger with every review. Families of victims asked difficult questions. Journalists asked difficult questions. Investigators asked difficult questions. Could more people have been warned? Could information have reached the public sooner? Could greater awareness have changed decisions made by individuals who unknowingly remained in danger? These questions carried enormous emotional weight because they touched upon possibilities rather than certainties. No investigation can fully reconstruct alternate histories. Nobody can know exactly what would have happened under different circumstances. Yet examining those possibilities became essential. The purpose was not merely to understand the past. It was to improve the future. As evidence continued to accumulate, another breakthrough emerged regarding the disguise itself. The police uniform and replica vehicle were not simply details within the story. They were central components of it. Investigators concluded that the deception likely enhanced the offender's ability to move through communities without immediately attracting suspicion. The disguise blurred the line between safety and danger. That realization deeply disturbed both investigators and the public. Modern societies depend heavily on trust. Emergency responders rely on trust. Law enforcement relies on trust. Communities rely on trust. The offender had weaponized that trust. In doing so, he exposed a vulnerability few people had ever seriously considered. The symbol people instinctively moved toward during emergencies had become part of the threat itself. As public hearings and reviews progressed, experts examined every stage of the incident. They studied emergency communications. They studied command structures. They studied information flow between agencies. Again and again, investigators encountered examples where confusion complicated decision-making. Information existed in one location but not another. Certain details emerged quickly while others moved more slowly. Communication challenges that might seem minor during routine incidents became critically important during a rapidly evolving mass casualty event. The breakthrough, therefore, was not one discovery. It was the recognition of an interconnected chain. The offender's preparation. The domestic violence history. The replica police vehicle. The communication challenges. The warning systems. The response decisions. Each element influenced the others. Each contributed to the overall picture. By the time formal reviews reached their later stages, a clearer understanding had emerged. The massacre was not solely the result of one factor. There was no single explanation capable of carrying the entire weight of the tragedy. Instead, investigators found multiple failures, multiple vulnerabilities, and multiple warning signs intersecting in ways that produced catastrophic consequences. This realization transformed the national conversation. The focus shifted from asking who committed the crime to asking what lessons could be learned from it. Experts in public safety began examining emergency alert procedures. Law enforcement agencies reviewed communication protocols. Domestic violence advocates highlighted connections between intimate partner violence and broader public violence. Researchers studied the case as an example of how complex warning signs can remain hidden until it is too late. The findings were sobering. Mass violence often appears sudden to the public. Yet investigations frequently reveal long histories beneath the surface. The Nova Scotia massacre followed that pattern. The violence itself occupied 13 hours. The conditions that preceded it developed over years. Perhaps the most painful breakthrough of all involved understanding the scale of loss in a deeper way. During the immediate aftermath, the public focused on numbers. 22 victims. Multiple crime scenes. 13 hours of violence. But investigations gradually restored individuality to those losses. Each victim became more than a statistic. More than a number within a report. They became teachers. Parents. Partners. Friends. Neighbors. Community members. People whose absence continued shaping lives long after the headlines faded. For families, This understanding was both comforting and painful. Comforting because their loved ones were remembered. Painful because remembrance could not bring them back. As the investigation approached its conclusions, one reality became increasingly clear. There would never be a perfect answer. No final discovery capable of explaining everything. No single motive that erased every question. No revelation dramatic enough to satisfy every uncertainty. Instead, there would be lessons. Difficult lessons. Necessary lessons. Lessons written in grief. Lessons written in failure. Lessons written in lives lost. The breakthrough was not the discovery of a hidden mastermind or secret conspiracy. The breakthrough was understanding the full complexity of what had occurred. Understanding that the tragedy was larger than one man. Understanding that warning signs matter. Understanding that communication matters. Understanding that trust can be exploited. Understanding that systems must be examined honestly if they are to improve. And most importantly, understanding that the victims deserved more than sympathy. They deserved answers. The investigation had spent years searching for those answers. Now the focus would shift once again. Away from evidence. Away from timelines. Away from investigative findings. Toward accountability. Toward public reckoning. Toward the question every society asks after a tragedy of this magnitude. What happens next? Because even though the killer would never stand trial, justice was not yet finished. The next chapter would determine how a nation chose to confront one of the darkest events in its modern history. Years have passed since the spring weekend that changed Nova Scotia forever. The fires are gone. The police roadblocks disappeared long ago. The flashing emergency lights that once illuminated dark rural roads have faded into memory. The news coverage moved on. The headlines stopped appearing. The cameras left. But for the people who lived through those days, the story never truly ended. Because tragedy does not conclude when the violence stops. That is often when the longest chapter begins. The chapter that follows loss. The chapter that follows shock. The chapter that follows the moment when the rest of the world returns to normal while survivors discover that normal no longer exists. For many communities across Nova Scotia, April 18th and April 19th, 2020 became dates permanently carved into memory. Not because people wanted to remember them. Because forgetting was impossible. Certain events divide time. There is life before them. And life after them. The Nova Scotia massacre became one of those events. In the years that followed, families learned something every grieving person eventually learns. Healing and forgetting are not the same thing. Healing does not mean moving on. Healing does not mean leaving the past behind. Healing means learning how to carry the weight without allowing it to crush every remaining part of life. That process is different for everyone. Some people seek comfort in memories. Others avoid them. Some talk openly about their loss. Others carry it quietly. There is no universal path through grief. Only the difficult reality of continuing forward while a part of you remains behind. For the families of the victims, grief often arrived in unexpected moments. Not during public ceremonies. Not during media interviews. Not during anniversaries. But during ordinary afternoons. Ordinary mornings. Ordinary conversations. The moments when someone instinctively reaches for a phone before remembering there is nobody left to answer. The moments when a birthday arrives. When a holiday gathering feels incomplete. When an old photograph appears unexpectedly. When a familiar voice is remembered so clearly that for a brief second it almost feels present again. Those moments become part of the landscape of loss. Invisible to outsiders. Permanent to those experiencing them. As communities rebuilt, physical reminders of the tragedy gradually changed. Damaged properties were repaired or removed. Scars on the landscape became less visible. Nature continued doing what nature always does. Trees grew. Grass returned. Seasons changed. Spring followed winter. Summer followed spring. The world continued moving forward. Yet emotional scars do not heal as predictably as physical ones. Entire communities had been forced to confront something deeply unsettling. The realization that extraordinary violence can arrive in places that seem immune to it. For generations, many rural communities have drawn comfort from familiarity. People know their neighbors. They recognize vehicles. They understand local routines. That familiarity creates trust. And trust creates a sense of safety. The Nova Scotia massacre challenged that assumption. Not because trust itself was wrong, but because the tragedy demonstrated how trust can be manipulated. Perhaps no detail symbolizes this more powerfully than the disguise. Years later, many people still find that aspect of the case uniquely disturbing. The firearms were frightening. The violence was horrifying. But the police uniform created a different kind of fear. A psychological fear. A fear rooted in uncertainty. Because the disguise transformed a symbol of protection into a tool of deception. It forced people to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. Sometimes danger does not announce itself. Sometimes danger arrives wearing the appearance of safety. That lesson extended far beyond Nova Scotia. Experts studying public safety, law enforcement communication, and emergency response examined the case extensively. The tragedy became a case study. Not because anyone wanted it to become one, but because the consequences were too significant to ignore. Investigations, reviews, and public inquiries eventually produced recommendations. Communication systems were examined. Emergency alert procedures were evaluated. Questions were asked about information sharing, decision-making, and public warnings. The goal was not simply to analyze the past. The goal was to reduce the likelihood of future tragedies. Whether every lesson has been fully learned remains a matter of debate. But the effort itself reflects an important truth. The most meaningful response to tragedy is improvement. Not perfection. Perfection is impossible. But improvement matters. Every lesson learned carries the potential to protect someone in the future. Every weakness identified creates an opportunity to strengthen a system. Every honest examination of failure creates the possibility of doing better next time. Yet even the most thorough reforms cannot answer every question. And that is one of the hardest realities of this case. Many people continue searching for a motive that fully explains what happened. A motive that transforms chaos into understanding. A motive that makes the unimaginable somehow understandable. But some crimes resist that kind of explanation. Human behavior is complicated. Violence is complicated. The darkest actions often emerge from combinations of factors rather than a single cause. Investigators uncovered histories of domestic violence, control, anger, resentment, and instability. They identified warning signs. They identified patterns. Yet no discovery provided a simple answer capable of satisfying every question. Perhaps that is because some acts exist beyond complete understanding. We can identify contributing factors. We can identify circumstances. We can identify failures. But understanding every detail of a person's internal world is another matter entirely. The desire for complete answers is natural. Human beings seek meaning. We want stories to make sense. We want causes to match consequences. We want darkness to reveal its origins. Yet reality does not always cooperate. Sometimes all that remains are lessons. And perhaps the most important lessons from Nova Scotia have little to do with the killer himself. Because focusing too heavily on the offender risks overlooking the people who matter most. The victims. In true crime stories, there is always a temptation to place the perpetrator at the center. To analyze every decision. Every action. Every detail. But history should not remember Gabriel Wortman as the most important person in this story. He was the cause of the tragedy. He should not become its centerpiece. The centerpiece should remain the 22 lives that were lost. The teacher whose students remember them. The healthcare worker whose compassion touched countless lives. The parents whose children continue carrying their memory. The neighbors who helped build their communities. The friends whose absence still leaves empty spaces. The police officer who never returned home. Those lives mattered before the massacre. They matter now. And they will continue to matter long after every discussion about the offender fades. Perhaps that is the most powerful act of resistance against violence. Remembering people for how they lived rather than how they died. Remembering their contributions instead of only their final moments. Remembering their humanity instead of allowing them to become statistics. 22 victims. It is a number repeated so often that it risks becoming abstract. But 22 lives represent thousands of memories. Thousands of conversations. Thousands of acts of kindness. Thousands of moments that shaped families and communities. No investigation can measure that loss completely. No report can fully capture it. No documentary, article, or podcast can restore what was taken. All they can do is remember. And memory matters. Because memory transforms tragedy into responsibility. Responsibility to learn. Responsibility to improve. Responsibility to honor. Responsibility to tell the truth. The truth is that Nova Scotia experienced one of the darkest events in modern Canadian history. The truth is that trust was exploited. The truth is that systems were tested. The truth is that lives were destroyed. But another truth exists as well. Communities endured. Families supported one another. Strangers helped strangers. People refused to allow violence to become the final chapter. That resilience does not erase the tragedy. Nothing can. Yet resilience remains one of the few meaningful responses available after unimaginable loss. When future generations study this case, they will likely focus on many things. The scale of the violence. The replica police vehicle. The failures in communication. The unanswered questions regarding motive. Those details are important. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is simpler. Evil often receives attention because it shocks us. Goodness rarely receives equal attention because we expect it. Yet throughout this story, goodness appeared everywhere. In the first responders who moved toward danger. In the survivors who shared painful truths to help investigators. In the families who transformed grief into advocacy. In the communities that chose solidarity over division. Those acts may not generate headlines. But they matter. They always matter. The Nova Scotia massacre will forever remain a story about violence. It will forever remain a story about loss. But it is also a story about what remains after violence ends. Memory remains. Love remains. Community remains. And the responsibility to learn remains. As the sun rises each spring over the forests, coastlines, and quiet roads of Nova Scotia, life continues. Children grow older. Families gather. Neighbors greet one another. Communities endure. The landscape looks much the same as it did before April 2020. But the people who remember know the truth. They know that beneath those familiar roads and peaceful horizons exists a chapter of history that can never be erased. A chapter written in grief. A chapter written in courage. A chapter written in 22 lives that deserved far more years than they were given. And perhaps the most respectful way to end this story is not by focusing on the man who caused the tragedy. It is by remembering the people who should still be here. Because in the end, they are the reason this story matters. And they are the reason it should never be forgotten. There are stories that end with justice. There are stories that end with answers. And there are stories that end simply because there is nothing left to say. The Nova Scotia massacre belongs to the last category. Even after years of investigation, public inquiries, reports, and analysis, the final weight of the story does not rest on a courtroom verdict or a legal resolution. It rests on absence. Absence of life. Absence of certainty. Absence of anything that could restore what was lost. Time moves forward, but it does not move evenly for everyone. For the outside world, April 2020 became part of history. A date recorded. A tragedy documented. A chapter filed away alongside other events that shocked a nation before slowly fading from daily attention. But for those directly connected to the victims, time never fully returned to normal shape. It fractured. Certain days became heavier than others. Certain places became impossible to pass without memory resurfacing. Certain sounds, certain words, certain moments carried echoes that never truly disappeared. This is what large-scale tragedy does. It does not only take lives. It reshapes the relationship between the living and the world they remain in. In Nova Scotia, the physical scars of the attack gradually softened. Rebuilding happened. Nature reclaimed damaged spaces. Communities continued functioning. But underneath that outward return to normality, something irreversible remained. A shared understanding that safety is not absolute. That trust, while essential, is not invulnerable. That even the most peaceful places can be touched by violence in ways no one expects. Yet alongside that understanding, another truth also emerged over time. One that is often harder to recognize, but just as real. The capacity for resilience is just as strong as the capacity for harm. In the aftermath of the massacre, people did not retreat permanently into fear. They supported one another. They organized memorials. They spoke the names of those who were lost. They preserved stories that might otherwise have disappeared into silence. They turned grief into remembrance. And remembrance into responsibility. Authorities, investigators, and policymakers examined what had happened not only to document it, but to learn from it. Reports were written. Procedures were reviewed. Emergency systems were evaluated. Difficult questions were asked about communication, preparedness, and decision-making under pressure. Not because answers would undo the tragedy, but because ignoring those questions would risk repeating it. That is the difficult logic that follows mass violence. Understanding is not optional. Even when understanding is painful. Even when understanding offers no comfort. Even when understanding cannot bring anyone back. At the center of all of it remain 22 people. Not symbols. Not statistics. Not case numbers. People. Each one with a life that existed independently of the moment it ended. Each one with relationships that continue to matter. Each one with a presence that cannot be reduced to the circumstances of their death. In many ways, the most respectful thing any narrative can do is resist simplification. Resist turning a complex human tragedy into a single explanation. Resist turning victims into background figures in their own story. Resist turning a community's grief into entertainment. True crime, at its best, is not about fascination with violence. It is about attention. Attention to consequences. Attention to systems. Attention to human lives that were interrupted. And attention to the uncomfortable truths that emerge afterward. The Nova Scotia massacre will be studied for years to come. Not because it is the only tragedy of its kind, but because it exposed layers of vulnerability that exist in many societies. The intersection of domestic violence and public violence. The complexity of emergency communication in rural environments. The psychological impact of deception during crisis situations. The fragility of trust in moments when trust matters most. These lessons are not unique to one province or one country. They are universal. Which is why the story continues to matter beyond its immediate geography. Yet even as experts analyze systems and policies, the emotional core of the story remains unchanged. A quiet spring night. A community that believed it was safe. A sequence of events that unfolded over hours instead of minutes. And lives that ended far too soon. No amount of analysis can erase that. No report can balance that. No explanation can resolve it. All that remains is memory. And responsibility. Memory of what happened. Responsibility for what must be learned. Responsibility for how future tragedies might be prevented. Responsibility for ensuring that the victims are not forgotten beneath layers of statistics and procedural language. Because when all investigations conclude, when all reports are published, When all discussions fade from public attention, what remains is the most human element of all. People remembering people. Families remembering loved ones. Communities remembering neighbors. A province remembering loss. And a country remembering that even in places defined by calm landscapes and quiet roads, unimaginable events can still occur. The final truth of the Nova Scotia massacre is not found in the movements of the gunman. It is not found in the timeline of events. It is not found in the technical details of the investigation. It is found in the lives that were taken and the lives that continue afterward. Lives that were ordinary in the best possible sense. Lives that should have continued. Lives that were interrupted without warning. And lives that now exist as memory, carried forward by those who refuse to let them disappear. In the end, this is what remains. Not the violence itself, but the people who were meant to live beyond it. And the responsibility to ensure that, even in their absence, they are never reduced to silence. Because silence is what the tragedy created. And memory is what stands against it.